You know, the story of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, it's one of the most remarkable and really one of the most American stories ever told. But what if the official version isn't the whole story? Today, we're digging into an account based on historical documents that paints a very, very different picture. And it all begins not with a divine vision, but with a magic rock in a hat.
So right off the bat, you're faced with two completely different versions of the man. On one hand, you have the traditional image, a pious, earnest farm boy, just trying to find religious truth. But then, the historical record, according to our source, tells a different story entirely. A young man who was actually put on trial for being a glass looker, which was basically a term for someone involved in folk magic, and, well, what some people would call a con artist.
All right, so here's our game plan for digging into the archives. First, we're going to look at his early days as a money digger. Then we'll see how one single stone gets used for two totally different stories. We'll also examine how his foundational first vision story changed over time, and then we'll get into the big controversies around the Book of Mormon and his secret practice of polygamy. Okay, so our story actually starts way before any mention of golden plates or new scripture. According to the source, Joseph Smith first made a name for himself in his community for something completely different, practicing folk magic. And this is an activity that would eventually get him hauled into court. See, the source material tells us the Smith family was really deep into what's called a magic worldview, which was actually pretty common back then. The whole area was buzzing with stories of buried pirate treasure, and folks would hire so-called seers, people like Joseph Smith, who claimed they could use a special stone to find it. Now this phrase, Joseph Smith the Glosslooker, that's not just some insult from a critic. No way. This is the official charge listed in an 1826 court case in Bainbridge, New York. The actual court documents show he was on trial for fraud, accused of tricking people by pretending he could find their lost property with his stone. And you know, for the longest time, people argued about whether this trial even happened. But the source points to this huge discovery, the original court documents. A researcher literally found bills from both the judge and the constable for arresting and trying Joseph Smith, the Glosslooker. This discovery confirmed an event that had been brushed off for years as just anti-Mormon propaganda. Okay, but this is where the story gets really interesting. That seer stone, the very same tool that was at the center of this fraud trial, it doesn't just go away. Oh no, it gets a serious promotion. It becomes the key instrument in the founding of an entire religion. And this really gets to the core of the source's whole argument. The method he used is described as being exactly the same. He puts his stone in his hat to block out the light and receive hidden knowledge. The only thing that changed was what he was looking for. Before, it was treasure. Now it was scripture. From this perspective, he didn't abandon folk magic, he just rebranded it. For decades, right, the official story was all about these special interpreters or spectacles found at the plates. The whole stone in the hat thing was kind of downplayed. But the source notes this was a huge deal. The LDS Church itself actually published photos of the seer stone, a plain brownish rock. By doing this, they pretty much confirmed what early critics and even witnesses had been saying all along about how the translation really happened. All right, so we've talked about the tool of translation. Now let's talk about the founding event itself, the first vision. According to the source, the story most people know today wasn't the first version. In fact, it changed a lot. What the source points out is that there are these two majorly different accounts. In his earliest telling from 1832, Smith describes a very personal, emotional experience. He's worried about his soul, he prays, and the Lord tells him his sins are forgiven. It's a pretty standard conversion story for that time. But then you jump to the official 1838 version, and the story is way bigger, way more grandiose. Now it's God the Father and Jesus Christ who appear, and the message isn't just about his personal salvation, it's that all of Christianity is wrong, and he's been chosen to restore it. And the official story gives a very specific reason for why he prayed, this massive religious revival in his town in 1820. But here's the kicker the source highlights. Local records show that there wasn't a big revival that year. There was one that fit his description perfectly, but it happened in 1824. Now that might seem like a small detail, but changing the date by 4 years really messes with the official timeline of when and how he was supposedly led to the golden plates. So the questions don't just stop with how he translated. The source also dives into the translation process itself and, well, the actual contents of the Book of Mormon.
And this brings up a really logical question, one that the source poses directly. We've all seen the paintings of Joseph Smith at a table with the golden plates right there, but the key witnesses themselves said they never actually saw the physical plates during the translation. Instead, they had to have a separate heavenly vision to see them with their spiritual eyes. So the question is, if the plates were physically in the room, why did they need a vision to see them? And then you get to what's actually in the book. The Book of Mormon describes this ancient American civilization that had horses, cows, sheep, wheat, even elephants. The problem, as pointed out by archaeologists cited in the source, is that none of that stuff existed in the Americas back then. They're what historians call anachronisms, things that are out of place in time. On top of that, the text lifts entire passages, including translation mistakes, directly from the 17th century King James Bible, which is pretty strange for an ancient American record. Okay, next up, the source gets into one of the most controversial parts of Joseph Smith's life, polygamy. And according to the documents, this whole practice didn't start with some public revelation from God. It started in secret. When you look at the timeline the source lays out, it's pretty eye-opening. The practice seems to have begun way back around 1835 with a teenager named Fanny Alger who lived in the Smith home. That relationship caused such a scandal that one of his closest friends, Oliver Cowdery, called it a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. And all of this was happening years before the official revelation on polygamy was written down in 1843. In fact, by the time he finally showed that revelation to his first wife, Emma, he had already secretly married more than 20 other women. And this number 8? What's that about? Well, this adds a whole other layer of complication. According to the source, this is how many of Joseph Smith's plural wives were already married to other living men. So this wasn't just about taking care of widows. We're talking about secret marriages to women who had husbands. And some of those husbands were his own loyal followers. So, okay, let's pull all these different threads together. What's the big picture that the historical record is painting here, according to our source? It really boils down to 4 major challenges to that traditional story. First, you've got this direct line from folk magic and treasure hunting right into religious prophecy. Second, you have the foundational First Vision story, which just wasn't consistent. Third, the Book of Mormon itself contains things that clash with what we know from archaeology. And finally, there's the secret, complicated origin of polygamy, which was practiced long before it was ever announced as a revelation. And that leaves us with this huge, fundamental question that honestly goes way beyond just this one story. What do you do when historical evidence seems to clash with a founding story of faith? When the documents you find in an old courthouse basement tell a different tale than the one you've always been told? How do you even begin to reconcile those two things? It's a tough question that really forces you to think about the relationship between history, belief, and truth itself.